I'm not ashamed to admit it. I have a love-hate relationship with gardening in raised beds. Let me know in the comments how you feel about gardening in raised beds. I've grown in raised beds for about the last 10 years. Prior to that, I had always only grown in ground. But at my last house, the only spot that had enough sun for a vegetable garden was an old 20 by 20 foot slab of concrete. I didn't have the time, money, or energy to remove it. So I did the next best thing and I put raised beds on top of it. After all, at that time, about 10 years ago, gardeners on YouTube and in books were saying raised beds were the way to go. They were the new way of growing things, and you just have to do it. If you want to have a good garden, you got to have raised beds. So I felt like, even though I was forced into raised beds, I was doing a great thing. I've done several videos extolling the virtues of raised beds. But to tell you the truth, here 13 years after my first raised bed experience, I'm really wanting that journey to end. Unfortunately, I can't because of that right there. I'll get more into that in a minute. But in case you haven't seen my other raised bed videos, I first want to go into the pros of raised beds very quickly so that you can make an educated decision if you're on the fence right now. The first pro would be I like the tidy, orderly look of raised beds. I just do. You also get a longer growing season. Typically in raised beds, the soil in them warms up faster in the spring than in ground beds. Raised beds also tend to have better drainage, so if you have heavy clay soil, raised beds are sometimes a great option. If you have back issues or mobility issues, raised beds bring the garden up to a comfortable height. You can grow more plants in a smaller space because of the great drainage and because typically you bring in good soil. You can grow right on top of a driveway, a cement slab like I used to have, asphalt, compacted soil, or contaminated soil. And it won't matter because the roots are confined to the bed. This is the last pro about raised beds, and that's the reason I'm still using them, and that is gophers. We have an extreme gopher issue here. If I don't grow in raised beds with gopher wire on the bottom, I'm at risk of losing a good majority of my crops. Each of the last 3 years, we've had gophers go around and around our beds in the paths, making mounds all over the place, but they're not able to get into the beds and cause a problem. Up here in the cottage garden, we don't grow in raised beds because it's just too big of a space. It would be almost impossible. And you can see in just the past month, we've had a lot of issues right here in the beds in the cottage garden. Plants being killed, dirt mounds everywhere. But up here, it's just flowers. It's not food for my family. And raised beds are great for all the reasons I just mentioned. But if I'm being honest, I wonder if I didn't have a gopher issue, would I just plant in the ground? And each year is pushing me closer and closer to just saying yes. If I didn't have gophers, I would probably abandon my raised beds in favor of in-ground beds. Why? Well, I'll give you 7 reasons. First of all, the materials. They don't all last a long time. With wood, you obviously get rot, dry rot, you get termites. That is the cheapest way to go. All my beds are made out of wood. They always have been. Not all of them. I'll get to those in a minute. Brick and stone beds, they last a really long time, but they're also really expensive. And you got to know how to put them in. And then there's fabric beds, which is honestly one of my favorites. They last quite a while. I've had mine for 3 years now, and they look almost brand new. So you really have to pick a material that's going to work best for your situation. The second reason is you got to either pay for labor or you got to, do the labor to put the beds together, no matter what kind they are. If you're handy, you can save a lot of money there. Now, if you want to do some raised beds out of wood, I will link a video down below where I show you step by step how I made mine. It's actually a fairly inexpensive way. It is wood, and so you will have to replace them probably every 4 to 5 years. But that is nothing compared to the cost of filling them, which is my third reason. It is by far the biggest expense, and unless you're using stone, maybe metal, it's definitely going to be more expensive than the bed itself. Now, there are some cheaper ways to do it. The hugelkultur way, where you can fill up the bottom part of the beds with branches and sticks and twigs and leaves and grass clippings and things like that to kind of take up some space before you put your premium potting soil or raised bed mix in the top. You do want 12 inches of the premium potting soil, minimum 12 inches. So if you have a 24-inch bed, the bottom 12 inches could be all this other stuff I mentioned. The top 12 inches needs to be good potting soil. And if you go that route, just know you're going to get a lot of sinkage throughout the year, because as you water, the good potting soil is going to fill in below in all the nooks and crannies in those twigs and branches. You also have to really do the research on the soil that you're filling the beds with. There's a huge grazon issue. Grazon is an herbicide that it's a broadleaf herbicide that will kill most of the crops that you try to grow in it, and it lasts in the soil for 3 years. So you got to be really careful. Make sure you're buying organic. Ask where they get their soil from. Just do your homework. The fourth reason I am starting to hate growing in my raised beds is they dry out too quickly. Now, this is probably the worst reason for me. We live in a dry climate. If I don't water my beds every day, every other day, and mulch them heavily during the summer, not only will my beds dry out in that short amount of time, but they will become hydrophobic, meaning it is very difficult to then get them wet again. In one of my beds, we have brand new compost put in there when we first moved in, so it's not a compost issue. And anytime that dries out for more than a couple of days, it's hard to re-wet it, especially with drip. You know, you really have to soak it and you have to mulch it. If you compare that to the free vegetable garden that I did up in the cottage garden starting in the early spring, it lasted until just about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I rarely watered it. It was free, so I didn't set up a drip system, and when I don't set up a drip system to something, it gets neglected. It would go almost 2 weeks sometimes without actually showing a need for water. That would never happen in any of my raised beds. More than a couple of days, and you can tell the plants are wilting. Some of the more tender ones are drying out already. It's just not fun. More than that, up in the cottage garden, last year we had just put that in, just put a brand new drip system in, and I didn't set the timer right, and I didn't realize that none of the watering was done for over a month in 85 to 95 degree weather. And I didn't notice because it didn't look bad. It wasn't growing very fast, but it didn't look dried out. Like I said, 3 days in a raised bed, and I would definitely know. Number 5 is they require more fertilizer because plants in raised beds, especially if they aren't open to the ground below, they can't look elsewhere for fertilizer. If you don't supply it, they can't go find it. They're confined to the raised bed. Plants in the ground, they just put their roots out deeper and wider and find what they need most of the time. So it's up to the gardener to fertilize every couple of weeks throughout the growing season. Number 6 is very little insulation. When you grow in raised beds, if you have perennial vegetables, you need to look at your zone because they are going to do a better job in the ground because the ground has all that soil insulating them than in raised beds. That raised bed soil is going to freeze a lot sooner, and you might never have in-ground freezes, but you could have an above-ground freeze. And same in the summer, a little insulation means they get hot. Even wooden beds get hot. Number 7 is the constant addition of new soil. And if you have raised beds, you know, soil disappears. It breaks down, so it condenses, it washes through the cracks, washes out the drainage holes, erodes. So one way or another, you're going to have to add new soil once or maybe twice a year. If you have a shorter growing season where you're just growing spring, summer, then probably one addition of soil in the spring will do you. But here we grow year round, so I end up adding soil in the spring and in the fall. I'm not trying to dissuade you from using raised beds. I'm just trying to give you an honest opinion from someone who has been there and done both over the years. So hopefully this gives you information to choose. Judge for yourself between the pros and the cons that I listed in this video. If you do go the raised bed route, there's a video right here you need to watch. It's raised bed mistakes that I have made, and I will tell you what those are so you don't have to make those. I'll see you guys next time.